January. Will and Jenny had spent almost every day with Lizbeth and her family since the holiday party. This included an evening at Jack's father's restaurant, Abe's, on New Year's Eve. Abe was working the line that night, so his family enjoyed the meal back at the chef's table. "I don't understand," Layla said to Lizbeth after they parted from the Darcy children. "What is it that you don't like about Will? I can sense some social anxiety, but I don't see why you think he's so unpleasant."
"Lizbeth, you ordered the same meal."
"It's like he's an introverted version of you," Becca said. The entire family had been amused, as Will and Lizbeth had ordered the exact same item throughout the dinner, including the sides and dessert. During dinner, Lizbeth and Will, after realizing they were both Matisse fans, decided to see the special exhibit of his work at the Met. Lizbeth was having a hard time putting her feelings, past and present, into words. Will was being better company this week than he had ever been in Georgia. She wondered if he was tolerating her because Jenny seemed to enjoy having a family around her. Will seemed inclined to give his sister anything she wanted to keep her happy. That was how Lizbeth ended up on the steps outside the museum. It was a sunny, cold day. There hadn't been any big snowstorms yet, so the ground was dry. She was excited to be wearing sneakers. She was there early and feeling nervous that Will wouldn't show up. Trying to look casual while waiting, she pulled out her Kindle and read one of the many books stored on it. "Hi," Will said. He was suddenly standing right in front of her. He had a relaxed smile on his face and seemed happy to see her. Lizbeth couldn't help but return the smile. Will had smiled quite a bit since she had apologized at the ice skating rink. She had not seen him scowl once since the party. Today he was wearing his heavy black pea coat with jeans and black chucks. Lizbeth was beginning to find his sneakers and coat comforting. Will helped her to her feet, and they walked up to the museum together. Will took their coats to the coat room while she got their tickets. Once his coat was off, she could see he was wearing a thin navy sweater with silver ribbing on the cuffs. Lizbeth noticed all the spots where the sweater clung to his body. She could see the broadness of his shoulders and chest. They said little as they walked to the Matisse exhibit. They stopped at the entrance and were handed clipboards with heavy sketching paper pencils attached in exchange for their tickets. "This is a special inspiration exhibit," the docent said. "Matisse liked to repaint and rethink his art. You will see a number of variations of the same painting in the exhibit. The curators would like you to feel free to draw your own revision or interpretation of anything you see. If you leave the artwork, it may be put up at the exit. When you walk out, you are welcome to look at what others have done. Just make sure to return the clipboards and pencils before you leave the museum." They began walking through the rooms looking at the paintings. There were, as the docent explained, different versions of paintings. This was a quality of Matisse that amazed Lizbeth. She especially enjoyed how he played with styles and colors. "I look at his works and think I'm looking through the eyes of a child," Will said, standing next to her. "It's the heavy use of primary colors, maybe. I like the older stuff, when he cut paper and pasted it on different paper." "Why?" "I think because it's very innocent and simplified. He doesn't really hide things in the shadows," Will said. "I like that he gives almost everything a second chance," Lizbeth said. She turned to look at Will, but saw no reaction to this. The more they walked around the museum, the more Lizbeth realized they liked a lot of the same pieces and artists for very similar reasons. They didn't draw while in the Matisse exhibit, but Lizbeth would periodically sit and doodle while listening to tour guides who led groups through the space. Her paper was quickly filled with little triangle butterflies and poorly drawn horses. "Suddenly I expect you to love unicorns and rainbows," Will said, sitting next to her on a bench and looking over her shoulder. "I do." "I was joking." "I'm not. I also love mermaids. Ask Becca. For years I was going to turn into one when I grew up. It was my career goal for quite a while."
"Are you a good swimmer?"
"Fantastic. I'm a much better swimmer than I am an artist." Will laughed at her. "You are great at riding horses and swimming? Did you want to become a unicorn later?" No, I was going to be a mermaid princess who came on land to ride her unicorns. That's why my grandparents bought me Windfola. Wil blushed, probably remembering his plan to buy her horse.
Then your income would be princess-based.
Obviously, a great plan. This time they both laughed. Wil wouldn't let her see what was on his paper. They left the exhibit and headed for a cafe in the museum to grab lunch. As they left the exhibits, Lizbeth saw him fold his paper and slip it into his back pocket. As they made their way to the cafe, they got distracted by a collection about roosters across cultures. They stood before a painting of a rooster called The Cock. Neither recognized the artist, but Lizbeth felt inspired. The thing that catches my eye about this cock is the color and shape. Notice the left curvature of the cock. The shape is of an average cock. What are your thoughts about the cock, Wil? Lizbeth said. She turned to face Wil and found him trying to stifle a laugh. Do you find cocks funny, Wil? A cock is nothing to laugh at. If you had a cock as grand as this, would you want people laughing at it? Lizbeth said. She would have continued, but she started laughing herself. She let Wil take her hand and pull her out of the room. You've seen my terrible drawings. Let me see what you did, Lizbeth said, once they were seated with lunch from the cafe. No, it's nothing. Wil, don't worry. I won't tell your aunt how you aren't a well-rounded young lady. Wil laughed at the joke, but refused to let her see what he had drawn. This isn't over. The more you refuse, the more I want to see what you drew, Lizbeth said as she got up to throw away their trash. She was standing at the trash can, throwing away their lunch, with her back to Wil, when she heard a familiar voice. Wil! Caroline called from the other side of the cafe. Lizbeth stood there for a moment, closed her eyes, took a deep breath, and collected herself. Ginny said you would be here, Caroline was saying when Lizbeth returned to the table. We thought we would come find you. Lizbeth saw she was not alone. Charlie had come with his sister.
Oh, Lizbeth, I didn't realize you were here too,
Caroline said with a sneer when she saw Lizbeth. Caroline's tone had changed as soon as she had seen Lizbeth. Charlie smiled broadly, pleased to see both Wil and Lizbeth. Lizbeth greeted the siblings once she was back at the table. You two are here together? Caroline asked Lizbeth, putting on her best fake smile. We both came to see the Matisse exhibit, Wil said. You were both here at the same time and ran into each other? Caroline asked. No, we decided to come together. Caroline's fake smile faded quickly. I didn't realize you two were speaking, Caroline said. Lizbeth looked at Wil to see if he would explain it. The scowl returned to his face, and the taciturn nature she disliked was back. For the first time, she wondered if the scowl had ever been about her. Wil got to his feet. It turns out Lizbeth and I have some associates in common. Really? Who? Caroline asked. My aunt. Caroline looked confused, but took Wil's arm, linking her arm through his. I'd love to see the Matisse exhibit with you, Caroline said as they walked away. Wil didn't protest as Caroline led him back toward the exhibit. Lizbeth and Charlie quickly followed. After a few moments of uncomfortable silence, Charlie asked, Have you spoken to Jane over the break? Lizbeth had briefly spoken to Jane, who was back at home in New Orleans. Yes. How is she? Lizbeth stopped and turned to Charlie. You should ask Jane. What? You know the way things ended between the two of you after Halloween? Yes. If you want to know how Jane is doing, then you need to talk directly to Jane and ask her. I'm not getting in the middle of it. I made enough mistakes last semester. Only Jane can tell you how she is doing. Charlie looked confused and started walking again. Lizbeth followed Charlie as he wove through the different rooms of art. Walking around the Met with Wil was a direct and obvious journey. You might see something that caught your eye, but you made your way to your destination. Walking with Charlie was like following a child with ADD. He had to stop and look at everything that caught his eye. Lizbeth felt like an indulgent parent, letting her child be curious and explore. Caroline and Wil weren't too far ahead of them. She could hear the clacking of Caroline's heels, and her voice carried from room to room. Caroline was leaving a wake of exasperation as she moved through the exhibits. Other visitors and docents were complaining, rolling their eyes, and glaring in her direction. When Lizbeth caught sight of Caroline and Wil, she could see the former clinging to the latter. She could see the scowl on Wil's face as Caroline prattled on, not looking at the art. They weren't even heading in the direction of the Matisse exhibit anymore. Lizbeth stopped walking when they got to one of her favorite Degas paintings, the dance class. Charlie wandered around the room, and Lizbeth sat down on a bench looking at the painting. She had spent years in the Met, and she frequently found her way back to the dance class. He has a thing for butts, in my opinion, but I don't know if you have noticed that, Wil said, sitting down next to her. Lizbeth nodded, but said nothing. She was suddenly exhausted and wanted to go home. Your scowl is back, Wil said quietly to her. I don't scowl. You do. You scowl. Trust me. Lizbeth felt ashamed that she was letting Caroline ruin their day. Wil's knee touched hers, and the small gesture made Lizbeth want to cry. Wil must have realized this as well, and pulled out his sketching paper from his jeans. Lizbeth watched as he unfolded it, and saw that it was a well-done sketch of her. Me? Why are you always surprised? Here, you can keep it. Let's get out of here before Caroline realizes where I am, Wil said with a smile. He got up, pulled Lizbeth to her feet, and they quietly made their way out of the room. If Charlie noticed, he didn't say anything. Ginny just sent me a text. She wants you to join us for dinner. It won't be fancy. You do not have to change clothes. Okay. They had grabbed a cab to make sure Caroline didn't catch up with them. Now they sat next to each other in silence. Lizbeth had slipped Wil's sketch into her purse along with her own doodles. She didn't know what she should do. She wanted to touch him, hold his hand, or kiss him. She just wasn't sure if it was appropriate. Before she knew it, they pulled up in front of his building, and they were in the elevator standing next to each other. She had lost her chance. Hi, don't be mad, Ginny said when the elevator door opened. Why? Wil asked. Caroline and Charlie are coming over too. Caroline said they lost you at the museum, so I told them to just come to dinner with us. Are we going out, ordering in, or is someone cooking? Wil asked. Someone is cooking. Becca. Wil turned to Lizbeth. She's very good, Lizbeth said. I'll go help her. You get wine. Wil did as he was told, and Ginny went into the kitchen to help the sisters. There will be 6 of us, Ginny told Becca before going off into another room. Who are the other 2 people? Becca asked Lizbeth. Charlie and Caroline, Wil's roommates at school. Please, no matter how much you dislike Caroline, butt out, Lizbeth said. What? I love you, but I know her, and the 2 of you will not mix well. Plus, I am pretty sure she thinks I'm competition. Becca sighed as she started a pot of caramelizing onions. Okay, but because I love you, I'll pretend this is dinner theater. You should know, you're her competition if it's Wil she wants. She has every reason to be jealous of you. Charlie and Caroline arrived a few minutes after Wil and Lizbeth. Caroline stood in the kitchen while Becca and Lizbeth finished dinner. Becca had been making French onion soup and roasting chicken before anyone had arrived. Lizbeth helped with final touches. All 3 siblings were good cooks, having spent much of their lives in a restaurant kitchen. Only Josh wanted to make a career out of it. While Wil and Charlie were around, Caroline was on her best behavior, especially if Ginny was watching. Caroline showed her true colors when Wil and Charlie went to clean up the kitchen after dinner. I heard Jorge has been hanging around the sorority again, Caroline said to Lizbeth once the guys had left. Did you know he and Wil grew up together? Excuse me? Lizbeth said. She looked at Ginny to make sure Caroline didn't upset the teenager. She could see the color rising in Ginny's face. Jorge, the admissions officer from Duke? Caroline said. I know who he is, Lizbeth said. I heard he spent Thanksgiving at your sorority house, and one of the officers went to Mexico with him or something. I assume this means you broke up. Lizbeth didn't respond. She saw Becca distracting Ginny and was relieved. She thought she heard Becca saying something about being roommates next year and how cool it would be. It was clear that Ginny was focused on Becca, but Lizbeth could see that she was anxious. "I think Caroline's a bitch," Becca said on the walk back to their house. "You're not the only one." "As we were leaving, she told Will that she thought you looked pale and exhausted. She suspected the stress of last semester must have caught up with you. What the hell is she talking about?" "What did Will say?"
Oh, you want to know what Will said now?
"Well, he said he thought you looked very refreshed and pretty, especially your eyes. Does he have an eye fetish?" "I don't think it's called a fetish unless it is a sexual obsession. But yes, he has a thing for women with pretty eyes." "I don't think he likes Caroline. Ginny had a change of heart about her tonight." "Really? It was the Jorge comment, wasn't it?" "Did she tell you about it?" "No, I was sort of dating Jorge for a few weeks, and I didn't realize he was a liar until Thanksgiving." "Is it related to why Will came to the house that morning?" "Yes." "Is it part of the reason why the two of you look like you constantly want to make out but never do?" "I don't know. Maybe." Lizbeth woke up the next day to her phone ringing. It was Jane calling with news that ruined all her vacation plans. As soon as she hung up, she rushed around the house,
Packing so she could get back to campus as soon as possible.
Lizbeth was in full panic by the time Will arrived that morning. They hadn't made any plans, but his presence felt inevitable. She wasn't in the mood for distractions. She had to get back to campus. She had to find Lydia. Layla was trying to calm her down,
But Lizbeth just wanted everyone to stop talking and simply do what she asked.
"I need to get back to campus tonight. I don't know where Mrs. C is. I don't know how much this is going to cost," Lizbeth said to Will through her tears. Lizbeth was struggling to focus. She was on hold with American Airlines, hoping to use her mother's miles to make this flight less expensive. At the same time, she was pulling clothes out of her dresser and closet and throwing them into her suitcase. There was a pile of used tissues in the trash can. Lizbeth had a sudden desire to let Will wrap his arms around her. Will looked around the room in confusion. He had his black coat over his arm. Lizbeth wondered for a moment if he had been planning this day in his head and if she was going to ruin all of it. "Lizbeth's in a panic," Becca said. "What happened?" Will asked. Lizbeth paused and tried to pull herself together. This was not the way she wanted Will to see her, not after all the work she had done to make things better between them. "Lydia," Lizbeth said with a hiccup. Will sat down in a chair by the bed. He leaned closer to Lizbeth and waited for her to continue. "She went to Mexico with Jorge. She got cash from Mrs. C to pay for the trip, and it might have been the sorority's money. Jorge took her and the money to an illegal casino and lost all the money he and Lydia had. He owes the casino thousands of dollars, which nobody can afford. Lydia is being held by the casino owners because Jorge ran off. She called Jane because she can't reach her parents and said someone beat her. She is afraid they will do worse. She is positive she'll be raped and doesn't know what to do. She swore she intended to pay back Mrs. C when she got her student loans, but she won't get anywhere near this much money." "Why did Jane call you?" Will asked. "Mrs. C isn't answering her phone, and Lydia's parents aren't answering theirs. Jane told her to call the embassy in Mexico and then called me because we solve our problems together. Jane's parents can't help. They don't think we should do more than call the embassy and keep trying to contact Lydia's parents." "Does Lydia know your family has money?" "What? No, but even if she did, we can't get that much money together quickly. It's all tied up in the restaurant and in trusts. Jane and I have no idea what to do, but we have to get back to campus and find Mrs. C.
She can get in touch with the national office about this."
Will sat there thinking. Lizbeth returned to her packing frenzy. She couldn't seem to focus and deal with her anxiety. Will's presence wasn't helping either. "Have you called Charlotte and Colin?" Will asked. "Yes. They have no idea where Mrs. C is, and they can't go to Georgia to look for her. None of her kids can." "She isn't with them?" "No. She did this at Thanksgiving, too. She told each child she was at another's house. I guess none of her kids speak to each other that often." "You never told anyone about Jorge, did you?" Will asked Lizbeth. Will, it's not my story to share. I couldn't do that to you and Ginny. I appreciate it, and I know she does too, but you have to tell people now. The national office will know what to do. Lizbeth didn't say anything as she paced around the room, trying to think of what to do next. She didn't know what to say. I can go back with you, Will said when she didn't respond. She couldn't look him in the eyes now. She didn't want to see his disappointment or the return of the scowl. No, I can't ask you to do that. There isn't enough time for you to get ready. We have to leave in a few minutes.
Are you sure? Yes, I need to fix this. Just let me go,
Lizbeth said, her voice almost a growl. Lizbeth looked at Will and noticed his stiffness, and as she expected, the scowl had returned. She couldn't worry about pushing him away. She was too focused on her guilt and not having told Lydia the truth about Jorge. If she had fought harder to get her to come to New York, or pushed someone else to invite Lydia to visit, maybe this could have been avoided. She wondered if Will was angry at her for letting this happen. I will see you back on campus then. I don't want to get in the way if you are about to leave, Will said as he got up and walked out of the room. Lizbeth returned to a quiet campus and house. She had never seen it so quiet, but felt like she was generating enough noise to make up for it. On the cab ride from the airport to the sorority house, she checked in with her family, Jane, Marie, and Charlotte. Jane and Marie were also on their way back to campus. Nobody had seen or heard from Mrs. C since the end of the semester. Lizbeth was hoping she would find her in the house when she got there. Maybe her phone had died or something minor. Lizbeth had called the national office and told them everything she knew. She gave them the phone number Lydia had used to call from Mexico and contact information for Lydia's parents. Lizbeth unlocked the house and turned on the lights. She heard the cabbie honk his horn. They had agreed on the signal before he drove away. Lizbeth turned off the alarm and turned on the heat. It was cold for Georgia. She walked through the house, going from room to room, hoping to see signs that Mrs. C was present. Everything looked pristine. The house had been cleaned just after everyone left. Her last stop was the door to Mrs. C's rooms at the back of the house. She knocked on the door and waited. Lizbeth didn't have a key to those rooms. They had never considered that someone would need to access them between semesters. She reset the alarm and took her things up to her room for bed. Lizbeth unpacked, including a dinner that Jack had prepared for her before she left New York. She sat at her desk, laptop open, trying to figure out what to do next. She created a list of things to take care of and a timeline to make sure they were addressed quickly. Lizbeth wanted to get Lydia help before people were back on campus next week. Before going to bed, she set her phone to wake her up early. She had to Skype with the people at the national office the next morning. She hoped they would be able to do something in the next 24 hours. Lizbeth woke up early to someone cuddling with her. She opened her eyes to see Jane. "You're here early," Lizbeth said. "Marie and I were both able to get earlier flights. She's making breakfast." "What time is it?" 7. Why? "We have a 9 a.m. Skype meeting with National."
I think all three of us should be involved. What about Mrs. C?
"Nobody knows where she is."
Are you worried? Yes. I called Charlotte.
And they hadn't seen her for the holidays. She was going to ask Colin's siblings if they know where their mother is. If she doesn't show up by tonight, I'm calling hospitals and the police. Lizbeth listened to her sorority sisters share stories about their trip home. Marie had a ton of new tech to share with them. "I think I'm going to make movies this year," Marie declared to Jane and Lizbeth. "You know, like a YouTube horror movie with found footage or something." "Like Marble Hornets?" Jane asked. "Last year was music, and the year before that fashion design," Lizbeth said.
I can score my own movies and design my own costumes.
"Touché." "I ate too much food and thought about what I want to do with my life," Jane said. "I did get some people at home to commission graphics and web page designs." Lizbeth and Marie gave Jane their complete attention. "I realized I'm not happy with the idea of being a teacher. I used all the flyers and web stuff I've done for the sorority, and I sort of launched a side business." "Really?" Marie asked. "Would you do graphics for my movies?" Jane laughed. "Do you like doing that?" Lizbeth asked. "I love it. Last semester, I had done some graphics and web pages for free. It gave me a nice portfolio and helped me get some businesses to pay me. I'm saving the money for Paris. When I went home for Thanksgiving, I started talking to New Orleans businesses. My parents helped put me in touch with people. Why didn't you tell me this before the break? You were so busy with your own stuff, and I wasn't sure if it was going to work out. But you've made enough money to pay for Paris? Oh, and then some. I'm pretty sure I am going to buy my first Longchamp purse in Paris, Jane said with a huge grin. That's fantastic. You should definitely design some graphics for Marie's YouTube channel, Lizbeth said. I can contribute if we need to chip in to help Lydia, Jane said. Lizbeth sighed at the idea. I hate to think of having a fundraising party to get Lydia out of jail, Marie said. Let's see what National needs us to do. We may have to take a huge hit to help cover the cost. We may have to let go of staff. I don't want to make decisions yet, Lizbeth said. Maybe the university will help, Jane suggested. Maybe Duke will help since they are the reason Jorge was on campus, Marie said.
The Skype meeting didn't go as well as Lizbeth hoped.
They spoke with Kylie from the national office. She was a perky former cheerleader type. She looked petite, skinny, and brunette, though the bad connection made it hard to tell. She wore her brown hair in an even bob. I wish I had better news, Kylie said. We've been in touch with the university's academic affairs office. I just got off the phone with our bank. We think the money and fraud may be the best thing to focus on. It looks like Mrs. Collins was making frequent and large withdrawals with checks directly at the bank. I suspect she kept the money for herself, gave some to Lydia, and maybe gave a lot of it to Jorge. Why do you think that? Jane asked. We have seen scans of the checks. She leaves memos on them that say, for Jorge. It's been on checks since late October, Kylie said. That's when he first met her. He and I were sort of dating, and she invited him to dinner one night. What about Lydia's safety? Lizbeth asked. Let me finish, Kylie said. We might be able to work with the police to pursue Jorge because of the money.
You should have had half your budget left, but right now you are barely going to be able to cover basic costs.
All we can really do now is help the police and let them know we are agreeable to giving Lydia a deal if she will testify against Jorge and maybe Mrs. Collins. She won't be allowed to come back to school. They're going to expel her for this. How much does the sorority have left? Marie asked. Kylie sighed. Mrs. C being fired will be a huge savings, but see if you can shave money in places. I don't think you'll have to cut staff. Think about, just in case the worst happens, what your minimal needs are. Lizbeth thought of what the bare minimum would be. Cooking, cleaning, and landscaping were all part of their budget. She had no idea about how many people were working for them. This was under the jurisdiction of the house mother, thus Mrs. C. Has anyone heard from Mrs. C yet? Jane asked. I've spoken to her daughter-in-law, Kylie said. She's an active sister? Technically, yes, Lizbeth said. Charlotte thought she had been on campus for all a break. The family is looking for Mrs. Collins, but nobody has any idea where she could have gone. Her credit cards are being used, and it looks like someone has gotten a few new ones in her name. They don't know if it's her or if her identity was stolen. Lizbeth sighed. She suspected she knew the answer. She made a mental note to mention Jorge and his habit of identity theft to Lydia's parents. What about getting Lydia home? Jane asked. We can't promise much, Kylie said. Lydia is an adult, and this wasn't an official sorority trip in any way. We've contacted the U.S. Embassy in Mexico for help. We can't do much more for her. Hopefully, their police force will be able to find her and help her.
Our focus is on the money and Jorge.
I wish I had better news about getting Lydia home.
You can touch base with her parents about it and see how you can help.
Are you washing your hands of this? Jane asked. No, we're just setting priorities. We're also worried about Mrs. Collins. She has several complaints filed against her from your members for inappropriate behavior. It's clear she's involved in this, but we don't know if she was willing or coerced. Lizbeth, you said yesterday that you know Jorge. What can you tell us? Lizbeth sighed and told the story Wil wanted her to share. After the Skype call, The 3 sorority sisters made an agenda and split the duties. Marie focused on finding Mrs. C, while Jane reached out to the other sisters, especially those who lived in the house, to see if they could help. Lizbeth dealt with Lydia's family. After that call was over, she went out and got lunch for the 3 of them. As they ate together, they reported what they learned. Jane started, and she looked panicked. It was a bust. Nobody can really help right now. I'm saddened by all of this. None of the sisters knew she was in Mexico. There had never been a group going with her. Everyone has said they'll chip in money if that is what we need, but we can't raise thousands of dollars quickly, and we'll need it for our bills. Maybe if we all save everything by the end of the semester, but she could be dead by then. I feel like we'll have to crowdsource her rescue. Lizbeth and Marie hugged Jane as she started to cry. I don't think Lydia has any real friends, Jane said through her tears. Kitty thought they were good friends, and now she's very upset about what happened.
Nobody can find Mrs. C, Marie said. The police said the family filed a missing person report. Charlotte said none of them know where she is. She and Colin are planning to be here for the first week of classes to meet with professors to plan their independent studies. If Mrs. C isn't back by then, they're going to look into hiring a private detective.
I think she is hiding because she knows what she did was wrong. Both women turned to Lizbeth. I don't know, but I hope it isn't true, Lizbeth said. Who has been filing complaints about her? I have, since the start of the semester, Marie said.
Without telling us?
Jane asked. You agreed to not rock the boat until the end of the year. I'm treasurer and secretary. I started a review of the bank account over the break. She's been having us pay for a lot of her own personal purchases.
Any gift she buys us, meals she feeds us, and any travel she does to spend time with us gets submitted as expenses.
She charged us mileage to go to the Halloween party, and then submitted receipts for the alcohol she brought with her. Clearly, I wasn't paying enough attention if she has been writing checks and withdrawing money on the side. Things just got so busy with finals. Lizbeth sighed.
Did she charge us for the Thanksgiving meal when she had Jorge and Lydia over?
Lizbeth asked. I was going to make a point of addressing it when we got back to school. She controls most of the banking, so she just paid herself back. Normally, I would see bank statements over towards the end of the next month after she resolved them with her records. It's fraud, and I was obligated to not only submit the financial details, but the context of why she was doing this. I'm going to make sure I see all the banking stuff first from now on, Marie said. You did the right thing without question. I just wish I had known. I'm not sure how nefarious her plan was.
She loves Lydia. If Lydia promised to pay her back and lied about using this trip to land a husband, Mrs. C wouldn't hesitate to help, Lizbeth said.
Why would Jorge want someone like Lydia? She is nothing compared to others in the sorority. You were a better pick for his motives, Lizbeth, but he gave up on you,
Jane said. What? Marie asked. Jorge would want someone with good credit to steal and lots of money to give him. That's why he went after Will's sister, Jane said. Oh, I get that, but Lizbeth isn't rich, Marie said. Lizbeth felt obligated to clear the confusion and explained her family's circumstances. Everyone on campus assumes I'm poor, and I never correct them. My family has money. My tuition expenses and spending money all come out of the trust. Jorge might have stolen my identity, and I just don't know it yet. I planned on checking my credit report, and then this happened, she concluded. Do you think he really did that to you? Marie asked. That could explain his sudden departure from my life. Lydia could have told him about her parents' continual trips to Europe, and he probably assumed that meant she was well off, or he simply picked his next and easier victim. Well, she would have made it easy, Jane said with a sigh. Maybe crowdsourcing really is the only way we can help, Lizbeth said. I feel so useless, Jane said. We have to focus on Mrs. C, Marie said. Finding her may be the only thing in our power.
Also check your credit, just to be safe,
Lizbeth said. Students started returning to campus over the next few days. Lizbeth and Marie talked to the staff about what was going on. None of them had any new information about what had happened to Mrs. C. They met with groups of sisters and explained what they knew about Lydia. When classes started on Monday, neither Mrs. C. nor Lydia returned. Charlotte and Colin came to campus for a few days and followed up with the police. They had a spare key to Mrs. C.'s rooms. They went through her belongings but found no sign of what had happened. Colin noticed that some of her personal items were gone. "He's very upset," Charlotte said on Tuesday when she and Lizbeth had lunch together. "He told me about Thanksgiving. When his brother called on Thanksgiving to speak to her, they all learned the truth about her staying on campus. She brushed it off like it was no big deal. I wish Colin and his siblings spoke to each other more often on holidays." "Well, that explains why he was so distracted." "His brother and sister are calling every night. Miss de Bourgh won't lift a finger to help us. Colin feels like he has to pick between his mentor and his mother." "Catherine is probably trying to imply that, but he has to do what he thinks is best." "Has anyone heard from Lydia since she called you?" "No." On Wednesday, they finally heard from Lydia's parents. The police in Mexico had raided the casino, shut it down, and Lydia was home. She wasn't talking yet, but Lizbeth agreed to ship some of her things home. Her parents said they would come out in a few weeks to get the rest of it. On Thursday, the news came that Jorge had been arrested, but Lydia made a deal and wasn't going to be charged with anything. Jorge arranged his own deal quickly and was going to spend about 5 years in prison. Lizbeth wondered if other states would file charges against him. On Friday, Mrs. C. showed up in her rooms as if nothing had happened. Marie was only too happy to contact the police, who took her in for questioning. On the following Monday, Kylie from Nationals swooped into town. "Mrs. Collins has been fired."
She hadn't spent all the money she had withdrawn from your accounts?
"So we were able to recover it. It will make things a little easier for you this semester. Her son Colin will come by and take her personal items to his home. Marie, do you think you would be able to manage the house until we find a replacement?" Kylie said. Marie looked at Lizbeth and Jane. It was all up to the three of them now. They had already talked about this and had taken on these roles. Marie would manage the money, Lizbeth would supervise the staff, and Jane organize the house. "This will be a great help. It took us a while to hire Mrs. Collins last summer, so it may be all semester," Kylie said. "I'm going to be around this summer," Marie said. "I can start working with potential new officers now to get them used to helping out." "What did Mrs. C. say happened?" Jane asked. "She told us that Jorge came into town for Thanksgiving, so she invited him to join her and Lydia. He was very attentive to her and seduced her." Marie made a face. "That was it?" Jane asked. "She was only too willing to give him money in exchange for the attention. She also wanted to push him away from you, Lizbeth." "Why?" Lizbeth said. "She wanted to get back at you for not marrying her son." Lizbeth rolled her eyes. "No, she was quite serious. She said you lied to everyone, but you're filthy rich and very well connected. You could have done wonders for her son's position in society. She had been trying all semester to get the two of you together, but you are, and these are her words,
a stubborn bitch who refused the best thing that could have ever happened to you."
Lizbeth, Jane, and Marie all laughed at the mere idea. "Anyway," Kylie continued as the other three laughed, "when Lydia claimed she wanted to marry Jorge, Mrs. Collins gave her some of the money she had withdrawn. She gave Jorge more just for the trip." "Wait," Marie asked. "He was sleeping with both of them? Mrs. C. was willing to give him up for Lydia?" "I believe he was sleeping with both of them, but what Mrs. Collins assumed about the relationship's future is not something I can speak to. Lydia claimed she wasn't aware the money she had been given was the sorority's money, but she had planned to pay Mrs. C. back. She only took about 1,000 from her. Jorge had tons of credit cards with him and kept using them. He swore the casino would be safe, and she believed him. When he disappeared, they took her to force him to pay. Well, to force someone to pay to get her back. We aren't sure who helped the police find the casino, but someone did, and paid back the money she took from Mrs. C." "What do you mean?" Jane asked. Lydia knows who saved her and paid the debt, but she isn't speaking much yet, and she said she promised she wouldn't say. Lizbeth thought that was odd, but was just happy that Lydia was home. She didn't have to look at Jane to know she was crying. She grabbed her best friend's hand and squeezed. We're glad she's home now, Lizbeth said. What about the money? Marie asked.
The bank might return what Mrs. Collins took because we pay for fraud protection. What we spoke about a few days ago is still relevant.
Cut where you can and see how you can raise some money and maybe get some newer sisters to move into the house. Marie, you admitted you wouldn't have caught the fraud in time. If she had only started doing this after Thanksgiving, it wouldn't have shown up until we got back from break, Lizbeth said, hoping to make her friend feel better. We should get one more person to help us, Jane said. Someone to take over for Lydia. Lizbeth and Marie knew this. Jane's little sister, Kitty, was more like Lydia than Jane. She had followed Lydia around and was quick to defend her big sister. Kitty may have been Lydia's only friend. She had offered to help with Lydia's responsibilities for events.
The officers had talked to her about what they wanted to do for the rest of the year.
Without Lydia to encourage questionable behavior, Kitty fell into line with what the older sisters wanted. Kitty will be great, Marie said. I think she just wants someone to look up to. I can keep her focused and train her to take on membership next year, Jane offered. You guys think we'll have enough experience leading the sorority to be president and membership VP next year? Marie asked. Of course, Lizbeth said. If you can get through this crisis, you can get through anything.